Hey guys, tonight we are taking a rather charming and slightly peculiar trip back in time to the bracing, windswept shores of Victorian England. We're not here to discuss industrial revolutions or imperial conquests. Oh no. We're going to explore the wonderfully quaint and often hilariously elaborate rituals of a Victorian seaside holiday with a special focus on a most ingenious and now utterly baffling invention, the bathing machine. Imagine yourself parasol in hand strolling along a pebbly beach, the air filled with the cries of gulls and the distant strains of a brass band. You see ladies in voluminous dresses, gentlemen in stiff collars, and then trundling towards the water's edge, these strange little wooden huts on wheels. This isn't just a trip to the beach. It's an adventure in etiquette, modesty, and the gentle art of not showing an inch more ankle than society deemed proper even when faced with the mighty ocean. And honestly, with those layers of clothing, the strict social codes, and the sheer faff involved in just getting into the water, you probably wouldn't survive a Victorian beach day without a strong cup of tea, a fainting couch nearby, and a very, very patient horse to drag your personal changing room into the waves. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe drop a comment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a delight to see our global community of history enthusiasts and night owls ready for another journey. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on the bustling promenade of a popular Victorian seaside resort, perhaps Brighton Scarborough or Margate sometime in the mid to late 19th century. The air is a bracing mix of salt spray, faint coal smoke from distant railway engines, and the rather more immediate aroma of hot donuts and freshly caught whelks being sold from nearby stalls. The sounds are a cacophony. The chatter of holidaymakers, the shouts of donkey ride proprietors, the rhythmic crash of waves, and the oompah of a municipal band gamely playing in a rather ornate, slightly windswept bandstand. This is the Victorian seaside in its heyday, a place of newfound leisure, health-seeking, and carefully managed social interactions. For many Victorians, a trip to the seaside was a novel and exciting experience. It was an escape from the smoky, crowded cities, a chance to breathe in the supposedly health-giving sea air, and an opportunity to partake in the increasingly fashionable and medically endorsed practice of sea bathing. But this wasn't the carefree splash about in a bikini kind of beach experience we know today. Oh dear me, no. This was the Victorian era, an age where modesty, propriety, and a rather complex set of social rules governed almost every aspect of public life, including most definitely how one entered the ocean for a dip. The very idea of men and women cavorting together in revealing swimwear was, to put it mildly, unthinkable for respectable society. The challenge then was how to experience the therapeutic benefits and the invigorating thrill of sea bathing without compromising one's dignity or offending public decency. And the answer, my friends, came on wheels. It was the bathing machine. A curious box-like wooden cabin, often brightly painted with a door at one end, and usually steps leading down from the other, sometimes with a canvas hood or awning to provide further privacy. These ingenious contraptions were designed to allow a bather to change into their bathing costume in complete seclusion, be wheeled directly into the water to a suitable depth, and then to emerge unseen by prying eyes on the shore directly into the sea for their allotted and often very brief period of immersion. It was a marvel of Victorian engineering designed not for speed or comfort but for the meticulous preservation of modesty. The whole enterprise was a bit like trying to have a secret bath in a tiny garden shed, while it's being gently towed into your local pond by a very patient workhorse. Historians still argue whether the primary impetus for the bathing machine's popularity was genuine, deeply felt modesty or a more performative social propriety dictated by the strict moral codes of the burgeoning middle class, who were now flocking to these resorts. Regardless of the exact balance, the bathing machine became an indispensable, iconic feature of the Victorian seaside landscape, a symbol of an era grappling with new forms of leisure while clinging firmly to its established codes of conduct. Its presence shaped the entire experience of going for a swim, turning a simple dip into a rather elaborate and sometimes slightly comical ritual. You're now standing on that bustling Victorian promenade, the salty air whipping at your no doubt impeccably arranged hair, and you've just been introduced to the star of our show, the bathing machine, that curious little wheeled cabin designed to preserve modesty at all costs. But before we delve into the intricate mechanics and etiquette of actually using one of these contraptions, let's take a moment to understand why you and thousands of your fellow Victorians are even at the seaside in the first place. The mass popularity of seaside resorts in the 19th century wasn't just a random fashion. It was driven by a confluence of social, economic, and technological changes that transformed the British coastline from a place primarily for fishermen and smugglers into a destination for health, leisure, and carefully orchestrated family holidays. For much of earlier British history, the seaside was often viewed with a degree of suspicion, even fear. The ocean was vast, dangerous, and untamed, its shores often barren and windswept. But by the late 18th and increasingly through the 19th century, attitudes began to shift. One of the primary drivers was a growing belief in the therapeutic benefits of seawater and sea air, a concept vigorously promoted by physicians of the era. This is a mainstream historical fact. The rise of British seaside resorts in the 18th and 19th centuries was significantly fueled by the medical fashion for sea bathing and the drinking of seawater prescribed by influential doctors like Richard Russell for a wide range of ailments from glandular swellings and melancholy to general debility. Dr. Russell, in his 1750 treatise, A Dissertation on the Use of Seawater in the Diseases of the Glands, essentially rebranded the chilly, formidable British Sea as a giant salty health spa. Suddenly, a bracing dip in the cold, choppy waves wasn't just an act of madness. It was good for you. People were encouraged to immerse themselves to let the invigorating waters work their medicinal magic. This medical endorsement provided a respectable, almost virtuous reason for well-to-do families to decamp to the coast. But another arguably more powerful factor was at play: the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the railways. As Britain industrialized, its cities grew crowded, polluted, and often unhealthy. For the burgeoning middle classes, and even for some segments of the working class who benefited from newly instituted, if brief, annual holidays or wakes weeks, the seaside offered a temporary escape, a breath of fresh and supposedly much cleaner air. And the rapidly expanding railway network, those iron arteries snaking across the country, made these coastal retreats more accessible and affordable than ever before. What was once an arduous multi-day journey by coach could now be accomplished in a matter of hours by train. Towns like Brighton, Blackpool, Scarborough, and Llandudno boomed, transforming from sleepy fishing villages into bustling resorts, complete with grand hotels, piers, assembly rooms, and of course rows upon rows of those indispensable bathing machines. You could leave the grime of Manchester or London behind in the morning and be paddling decorously, of course, by tea time. The railway didn't just carry people. It carried the dream of a healthier, more leisurely life, even if only for a week or two. The Victorian era also saw a growing emphasis on leisure and recreation, at least for those who could afford it. The concept of the family holiday began to take shape. The seaside offered a whole host of wholesome, or at least socially acceptable amusements: strolling along the promenade, listening to band concerts, building sandcastles, though perhaps with less architectural ambition than today's efforts collecting shells and seaweed, enjoying donkey rides on the beach, and, for the more adventurous, that all-important sea bath. It was a place where families could be seen, where social rituals could be performed, and where one could partake in the fashionable pursuit of taking the air and benefiting from the ozone. Whatever that actually meant to them. Probably something to do with smelling slightly less of coal smoke and more of salty fish. There's a quirky little tidbit that some early seaside resorts also promoted the drinking of seawater, not just bathing in it as a health cure. Imagine that part of your holiday prescription might involve downing a daily pint of lukewarm, salty, and possibly rather gritty English Channel. It's a wonder anyone's stomach survived the experience, let alone felt rejuvenated by it. One imagines the local purveyors of gingerbread and meat pies did a roaring trade with people trying to get the taste out of their mouths. Another pint of the finest brine for you, Madam Excellent, for the humors, and perhaps a large, sugary biscuit to follow just to settle the everything. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for the Victorian flocking to the seaside was genuinely a quest for improved health, or if it was more driven by social aspiration, the desire to participate in a fashionable, new form of leisure, and the simple human need for a change of scenery and a bit of fun, with the health benefits serving as a convenient and respectable justification. It was likely a potent mix of all these elements. A perfect storm of medical advice, technological advancement, economic change, and evolving social attitudes that turned the British coastline into the nation's playground. And at the heart of that playground, waiting patiently on the sand, were those curious wheeled cabins ready to facilitate the all-important, health-giving, and incredibly modest dip in the sea. You're now fully immersed in the atmosphere of a booming Victorian seaside resort. The salty air filled with the promise of health and genteel leisure, all made accessible by those marvelous new railways. You understand why everyone from a respectable middle-class family to perhaps even a daring member of the aristocracy is here. And one of the primary activities, the one often prescribed by doctors and eagerly anticipated or perhaps quietly dreaded by visitors, is sea bathing. But before you can even think about approaching one of those wheeled bathing machines we've glimpsed, you need to consider a matter of utmost importance in the Victorian era: your bathing attire. This wasn't a casual affair of slipping into a pair of trunks or a sleek swimsuit. Oh no. Victorian bathing costumes were formidable garments designed with modesty as their absolute unwavering priority, often at the complete expense of practicality, comfort, or anything remotely resembling hydrodynamics. Imagine yourself a Victorian lady preparing for your prescribed dip in the sea. Your bathing costume would likely be made of a heavy opaque fabric like serge flannel, or a sturdy wool materials chosen not for their quick-drying properties. They had none, but for their ability to conceal the female form and not become too clingy or revealing when wet. This is a mainstream historical fact. Victorian bathing costumes for women were typically voluminous, multi-layered garments, often consisting of a long, loose-fitting gown or tunic worn over equally concealing bloomers or trousers that reached the ankles or calves, all made from heavy fabrics like wool or serge to ensure modesty even when wet. The goal was complete coverage from neck to ankle, and sometimes even including long sleeves. You'd be swathed in what essentially amounted to a woolen dress, probably in a suitably drab color, like navy blue, gray, or a rather uninspiring dark brown, lest any bright hues draw undue attention. This gown might be trimmed with braid or ruffles, perhaps with a sailor collar, for a dash of nautical chic, but its primary function was to obscure. Underneath this, you'd wear a pair of voluminous bloomers or trousers, often made of the same heavy fabric, cinched at the ankles or calves with drawstrings or elastic. The idea of showing even an inch of bare leg was for many respectable women simply out of the question. To complete the ensemble, you might also be required to wear dark stockings and special bathing slippers or shoes made of canvas or even leather to protect your delicate feet from the harsh pebbles or unseen horrors lurking in the shallows. And of course, to ensure your feet remained modestly covered. And let's not forget the headgear. A bathing cap, often an elaborate affair of oiled silk or rubberized fabric, perhaps adorned with ruffles or ribbons, was essential to keep your carefully arranged coiffure from becoming a sodden mess, and to further frame your face in an appropriately demure fashion. You were less beach babe and more respectable lady attempting to have a very serious, slightly damp and heavily chaperoned encounter with a large body of water. For gentlemen, the attire was somewhat less voluminous but by no means liberating by modern standards. Men's bathing costumes typically consisted of a one-piece knitted woolen garment, often horizontally striped in bold colors like red and white or blue and white, which covered the torso and extended down to the knees or mid-calf. Think of a slightly saggy, very itchy, full-body onesie. While it offered more freedom of movement than the ladies' attire, it was still made of wool, which when wet would become incredibly heavy, cling uncomfortably, and take an absolute age to dry. Some more daring gentlemen might opt for shorter drawers, but the all-in-one neck-to-knee or lower woolen suit was the common standard. They too might wear bathing slippers and perhaps a jaunty straw boater, or a simple cap, though head covering was less stringently enforced for men. The sheer weight of these wet woolen garments was a significant factor. Imagine trying to swim, or even just wade gracefully while encumbered by several pounds of sodden flannel or clinging wool. It must have been exhausting. There are contemporary accounts and illustrations that show bathers looking rather like drowned rats, their heavy costumes sagging and dripping, hardly the picture of seaside elegance. It makes you wonder if the health benefits of the cold seawater were somewhat negated by the risk of catching a chill from remaining in damp, heavy wool for an extended period. Perhaps the vigorous toweling off process afterwards was considered part of the therapeutic exercise. There's a quirky little tidbit regarding the perceived decency of these costumes. Despite all these layers and the heavy fabrics, moral guardians of the era still fretted. There were concerns that even these voluminous outfits, might when wet cling in an unseemly manner, revealing too much of the human form. This led to endless debates in newspapers and pamphlets about the proper cut material and even color of bathing attire to ensure that no accidental or intentional impropriety occurred. Some resorts even had specific rules with beach inspectors or mistresses of ceremonies, ensuring that costumes met the required standards of decorum. It was a serious business, this business of not offending public morals, even when you were mostly hidden inside a wooden box on wheels. One popular solution to the clinginess problem for ladies was to have weights sewn into the hems of their bathing gowns to ensure they billowed gracefully in the water, rather than, heaven forbid, adhering too closely to the leg. Imagine trying to stay afloat with lead weights in your skirt. It adds a whole new level of challenge to your leisurely dip. Historians still argue whether these cumbersome bathing costumes were solely a product of Victorian prudery and the desire for social control, or if they also reflected genuine, deeply held personal beliefs about modesty and the sanctity of the body, differing across class and individual conviction. It was likely a complex interplay of societal pressure, religious morality, and personal comfort levels, all resulting in these rather extraordinary feats of textile engineering designed for a brief, chaperoned encounter with the ocean. So before you even get to the bathing machine itself, you're already engaged in a significant sartorial struggle swaddled head to toe in enough fabric to upholster a small sofa. You are now, in your Victorian imagination, fully kitted out in your rather substantial and decidedly unstreamlined bathing attire. Perhaps a heavy serge gown over voluminous bloomers, if you're a lady, or a fetching if slightly itchy knee-length woolen striped suit, if you're a gentleman. You've navigated the sartorial challenges of 19th century swimwear, all in the name of modesty and a bracing dip in the sea. Your next encounter on this seaside adventure is with the very vehicle designed to transport you in all your decorously clad glory into the waves, without revealing so much as an untoward ankle to the prying eyes of the promenade, the bathing machine. So let's take a closer look at this iconic and, frankly, rather peculiar piece of Victorian seaside furniture. Behold the bathing machine. Picture a small wooden cabin not much larger than a modern garden shed, or a particularly cramped changing room set atop 2 or 4 sturdy wheels, often with wide iron rims designed to roll over the sand and pebbles of the beach. It typically had a door at the landward end through which you would enter, and often steps leading down from the seaward end directly into the water. The walls were usually made of painted wood or sometimes canvas stretched over a wooden frame, providing complete visual privacy. The roof was often slightly pitched or curved to allow rainwater to run off. Some were quite plain and utilitarian-looking, like little more than sentry boxes on wheels, while others, particularly at more fashionable resorts, could be rather more ornate, painted in cheerful stripes or seaside pastels, perhaps, with little shuttered windows kept firmly closed during changing, of course, and even a fanciful name painted on the side like the Neptune or Sea Nymph's Bower. It was in essence your personal mobile changing room and aquatic launch vehicle, all rolled into one. Or less charitably, a tiny, windowless wooden box designed to make a simple swim as complicated and as publicly private as humanly possible. The primary purpose of the bathing machine, as we've established, was to uphold the strict standards of Victorian modesty when it came to sea bathing. This is a mainstream historical fact. Bathing machines, which first appeared in the mid-18th century but reached their peak popularity in the 19th century, were specifically designed to allow bathers to change out of their street clothes into bathing costumes in privacy, and then be wheeled directly into the sea where they could descend into the water without being seen from the shore. This segregation from public view was considered essential, especially for women, but men too in many resorts were expected to use them to avoid any unseemly displays on the open beach. One of the most distinctive features of many bathing machines, particularly those intended for ladies, was a canvas hood or awning that could be lowered from the seaward end, extending from the doorway of the machine down to the surface of the water. This created a sort of private canvas tunnel, a modesty hood, ensuring that the bather was completely concealed from any curious onlookers on the beach or promenade, even as they made their descent into or ascent from the bracing waves. It was like having your own personal, retractable privacy screen that followed you right into the ocean. Very practical if you didn't mind feeling like you were entering the water via a rather damp and gloomy fabric chute. The wheels were a crucial element. Early bathing machines might have been smaller and perhaps dragged by hand, But the classic Victorian bathing machine was a more substantial affair, often requiring the services of a sturdy horse, or sometimes a pair of donkeys, or even a couple of strong bathing attendants if horses weren't available. Or the tide was particularly tricky to pull it across the beach and into the water to a suitable depth. This depth was important, deep enough so that the bather could be submerged to the prescribed degree for the therapeutic benefits, but not so deep that the machine itself floated away, or the bather found themselves immediately out of their depth upon exiting. The drivers of these horse-drawn aquatic cabins had to be skilled at judging the tides and the slope of the beach. You didn't want your private changing room suddenly becoming an unmoored, gently bobbing island of despair. Inside the bathing machine was usually quite Spartan. There might be a small wooden bench to sit on while changing a few pegs on the wall to hang your street clothes, and perhaps a small salt-streaked mirror if you were lucky, and if it hadn't been too rattled by the journey across the pebbles. The floor would likely be damp and sandy. Space was at a premium, and the whole experience of changing inside one while it was being trundled towards the sea must have been a rather wobbly and claustrophobic affair. There's a quirky little tidbit that some bathing machines, particularly those at the more upmarket resorts, might have offered tiny luxuries within their cramped confines. Perhaps a small flask of fresh water for a post-dip rinse, highly unlikely for most, but one can dream, or a dedicated hook for one's parasol. More commonly, the luxury was simply the presence of a hopefully clean towel provided by the bathing machine proprietor. Some even had a little bell or flag system so the bather could signal to the attendant on shore when they were ready to be pulled back in like a very sedate waterlogged room service request. Driver, my allotted 7 minutes of frigid immersion are complete. Retrieve my mobile cabin forthwith. Historians still argue about the precise social nuances and variations in bathing machine design and usage across different resorts and for different social classes. Were the machines used by working-class holidaymakers significantly different from those used by the gentry? How strictly were the rules of their use enforced? And did men and women always use entirely separate machines? Or were there family machines in some more progressive or perhaps just overcrowded locations? The details could vary, but the fundamental principle of wheeled privacy remained the dominant feature of Victorian sea bathing for decades. It was a triumph of social engineering over simple, straightforward swimming. You are now standing before one of these remarkable Victorian contraptions, the bathing machine looking like a brightly painted garden shed that has inexplicably sprouted wheels and developed a longing for the sea. You're clad in your suitably voluminous and rather weighty bathing attire, ready to brave the English Channel or perhaps the North Sea, all in the name of health and decorum. But how does one actually go about using this wheeled cabin of modesty? It wasn't simply a case of hopping in and hoping for the best. Oh no. The process of hiring and utilizing a bathing machine was often a rather formal affair involving attendants' specific procedures and, of course, the payment of a fee. It was less, grab your towel and go, and more, engage in a carefully orchestrated aquatic deployment sequence. First, you would need to locate the bathing machine proprietor. On any popular Victorian beach, there would likely be rows of these machines lined up on the sand or shingle above the high tide mark, each perhaps belonging to a different owner or a larger bathing establishment. You'd approach the attendant often, a sturdy, weather-beaten individual male for the gentlemen's machines, female for the ladies, who would inform you of the price for a single dip, or perhaps for a certain period of time. This is a mainstream historical fact. The use of bathing machines in Victorian seaside resorts was a commercial enterprise, with bathers typically paying a fee to a proprietor for the hire of a machine and the services of its attendants, including the horse and driver, and often specialized dippers or bathers for women and children. The fee paid, you would be allocated your machine. It might be one that was currently on the shore, or you might have to wait for one to return from its watery excursion with a previous bather. Once your private wave wagon, as we might affectionately call it, was ready, you would ascend the steps at the landward end and enter the small cabin. The attendant would then close the door firmly behind you, ensuring your complete privacy from the curious gazes of those still on the beach. Now you were in your own little wobbly world, ready for the next stage of the adventure. For ladies, the process often involved more specialized assistance. Female attendants, known as bathers, or more evocatively dippers, were a common feature at many resorts. These were typically strong, experienced local women often from fishing families who were adept at managing the machines and, more importantly, at assisting the female bathers into and out of the often cold and surprisingly boisterous sea. The dipper might be the one who communicated with the horseman to guide the machine to the correct depth, and she would be waiting for you at the seaward door, ready to offer a steadying hand, and sometimes a rather more vigorous form of assistance. Think of them as a combination of lifeguard, personal attendant, and very robust bathing buddy, all rolled into one formidable, usually bonneted package. Gentlemen, on the other hand, were generally expected to manage their own plunge with less direct assistance, though a male attendant would still be responsible for the machine itself. Once you had paid your dues and selected your machine, or had it selected for you, the next step was the actual journey into the water. But before that, the all-important change of clothes, which we'll get to in our next cozy section. For now, just imagine the scene, you inside your little wooden box, perhaps peeking out of a tiny, salt-grimed crack in the wood as the horse is hitched up. There's a shout from the driver, a jingle of harness, a creak of wheels, and your personal seaside cabin begins its slow, bumpy, and slightly undignified trundle across the beach towards the waves. It's like being in a very small, very exclusive, and rather rudimentary amphibious vehicle on a mission of utmost modesty. There's a quirky little tidbit that some bathing machine proprietors, to attract more customers or to cater to the higher end of the market, might have offered slightly more luxurious machines. These might be a fraction larger, perhaps, with a slightly more comfortable bench, a less cracked mirror, or even, gasp, 2 hooks for your clothes instead of 1. Some might have boasted of using only the freshest, i.e., least frequently used that day towels, or employing dippers known for their particularly gentle yet firm technique of immersion. It was all about the subtle distinctions in a market where the basic product was essentially a shed on wheels. You weren't just hiring a box. You were hiring an experience, however damp and brief that experience might be. Only the best for Mrs. Peabody's therapeutic dip fetched the Britannia, with the extra peg and the slightly less sandy floor. Kias. Historians still argue about the exact power dynamics and social interactions between the bathers, often middle or upper class, and the bathing machine attendants, usually working class. Were the dippers seen merely as servants, or did their specialized skills and intimate role in the bathing process afford them a certain unique status, or even a degree of informal authority on the beach? Their memoirs, alas, are largely unwritten, but one can imagine they had some very interesting stories to tell about the vanities, fears, and peculiar habits of their clientele. So your transaction is complete, your machine is secured, and the anticipation or perhaps trepidation builds. You are about to entrust your person and your Victorian sense of propriety to this wheeled wooden box and its associated team of attendants and horsepower, all for the sake of a brief, chilly, but reputedly health-giving encounter with the sea. The gentle art of using a bathing machine was as much about navigating these preliminaries as it was about the dip itself. You've successfully hired your private wave wagon, your very own bathing machine, and the door has just been firmly closed behind you by the attendant, shutting out the sights and sounds of the bustling Victorian beach. Now, as your wheeled cabin begins its slow, bumpy trundle towards the sea, you are faced with the next crucial and often rather challenging stage of this seaside ritual, changing out of your cumbersome street attire and into your equally cumbersome but officially sanctioned bathing costume, all within the cramped, swaying, and distinctly unluxurious confines of the machine's interior. This was the Victorian equivalent of trying to change into a superhero costume inside a phone booth. But if the phone booth was also being gently towed across a pebble beach by a slightly impatient horse, imagine the space. Bathing machines were not known for their generous dimensions. You're in a small wooden box, perhaps only a few feet square. There's likely a narrow wooden bench along one side, a few pegs on the wall for your clothes, and if you're particularly fortunate, a tiny, salt-streaked mirror that probably offers a rather distorted and unflattering reflection. The floor is likely to be damp, gritty with sand from previous occupants, and smelling faintly of salt water, old wood, and perhaps a hint of nervous perspiration. As the machine lurches and sways over the uneven beach, maintaining your balance while attempting to unlace corsets, unbutton multiple layers of petticoats, or wrestle out of a stiff gentleman's frock coat would have been an acrobatic feat in itself. This is a mainstream historical fact. The interior of a typical Victorian bathing machine was extremely small and basic, offering minimal space and few amenities, making the process of changing clothes a cramped and often awkward experience for the bather, especially while the machine was in motion. For you as a Victorian lady, the process would be particularly complex. First, you'd have to remove your hat, your gloves, your shawl or cape, and then begin the delicate operation of undoing the multitude of hooks, eyes, and buttons that secured your fashionable but highly restrictive street dress. Then came the corset, that whalebone enforcer of the ideal hourglass figure, which would need to be unlaced, a task often requiring assistance in everyday life. But here in the solitary confinement of your rolling hut, you were largely on your own, unless you'd brought a very nimble personal maid who somehow also fit inside. Once free of the corset's embrace, a moment of sweet, if temporary, relief. One imagines you'd tackle the petticoats, the chemise, the drawers, and the stockings. Each discarded layer would need to be carefully folded or hung on those few precious pegs, lest it fall onto the damp, sandy floor and become an unwearable mess for your return journey. It was like a carefully choreographed striptease, but with absolutely zero glamour and a much higher chance of getting a splinter. Having finally divested yourself of your everyday armor, you would then face the challenge of donning your bathing costume. That heavy serge or flannel gown, those voluminous bloomers, the dark stockings, and the rubberized bathing cap. Pulling these often damp-feeling, unyielding garments onto your skin in the confined, stuffy space while the machine continued its bumpy progress towards the waves required considerable dexterity and probably a good deal of quiet, unladylike grunting. You'd be hoping fervently that the horse pulling your machine wasn't in a particular hurry that day, or that the beach wasn't exceptionally pebbly as each jolt threatened to send you tumbling into a heap of wool and flustered dignity. For gentlemen, the process was somewhat simpler, involving fewer layers and no corsetry, thank goodness. But wrestling out of a formal coat, waistcoat, starched collar, and trousers, and then into that often itchy one-piece knitted woolen bathing suit, still presented its own set of challenges in the limited space. There was always the risk of dropping a crucial cufflink into a dark corner, or discovering too late that a mischievous sand flea had taken up residence in the folds of your bathing attire. There's a quirky little tidbit that some bathing machines were rumored to have a tiny, strategically placed knothole or a loose plank that allowed for a discreet, if highly improper, peek at the beach, or more alarmingly, allowed someone on the beach to peek in. While proprietors undoubtedly tried to maintain the integrity of their machines, the salty air and rough handling would take their toll on the woodwork, and one can only imagine the frisson of horror if a bather realized their private changing room wasn't quite as private as advertised. Good heavens, is that Mrs. Higgins from number 12 actually seeing me attempt to untangle my bloomers from my bonnet strings? The shame, the unutterable shame. Historians still argue about the average time it took to change within a bathing machine and how much assistance was typically permitted or sought, especially for ladies with particularly complex attire. Did the dippers sometimes help with the unlacing or buttoning from outside the slightly ajar door? Or was it strictly a solitary struggle? The logistics of it all are both fascinating and slightly terrifying to contemplate from our modern perspective of quick, dry fabrics and easy-zip changing rooms, as you finally stand there transformed from a respectable land-dwelling Victorian into a heavily swaddled sea-bound amphibian. Your street clothes precariously hung, the machine gives a final lurch and comes to a halt. Through the seaward door or under the canvas hood, you can hear the gentle lapping, or perhaps the rather more vigorous crashing of the waves. Your private wheeled dressing room has reached its destination. The ordeal of the cramped change is over. The ordeal of the cold sea is about to begin. You are now fully, if rather uncomfortably, ensconced in your Victorian bathing costume, having successfully navigated the sartorial gymnastics required within the cramped and gently swaying confines of your personal bathing machine. Your street clothes are with any luck hanging neatly on the provided pegs, and you are bracing yourself for the next stage of this elaborate seaside ritual. The machine has juddered to a halt, likely with its seaward end now submerged to a depth deemed appropriate by the bathing machine attendant or the horseman. It is time for your wheeled cabin to complete its primary function, to deliver you modestly and discreetly into the embrace of the ocean. And this journey from the dry sand to the watery depths was most often powered by good old-fashioned horsepower, or sometimes by the equally sturdy, if less glamorous efforts of human attendants. Imagine the scene from outside if you could peek through a non-existent and highly improper window. A line of these sturdy wooden bathing machines, like a row of brightly colored, slightly eccentric beach huts on oversized wheels, would be waiting at the edge of the sand. As each bather indicated, they were ready perhaps by a polite knock from within or a signal to the attendant. A horse, or sometimes a pair of horses or donkeys, would be hitched to the front of the machine. These were not typically sleek racehorses or elegant carriage ponies. More often, they were robust, patient, and probably slightly world-weary draft animals, accustomed to the peculiar demands of their job. This is a mainstream historical fact. Bathing machines were commonly drawn into and out of the water by horses, although in some locations or for lighter machines, human power attendants pushing or pulling was also used, especially during busy periods or on particularly soft sand. With a word from the driver, often a boy or a man who specialized in this task, his trousers rolled up, his face weathered by sun and sea spray, the horse would lean into its harness, and your little wooden box would begin its stately, if somewhat bumpy, progress towards the waves. You inside would feel the lurch as the machine started to move, the wheels crunching over pebbles, then sinking slightly into the wet sand. The sounds from outside would change, the distant cries of vendors and promenaders giving way to the closer rush and sigh of the surf. It must have been a curious sensation being transported in this enclosed private space, gradually moving from land to sea, like a very sedate, very proper amphibious landing craft on a mission of therapeutic immersion. The horse would wade patiently into the water, often up to its belly, or even its chest, pulling your machine behind it until it reached the desired depth. The driver would then unhitch the horse, leading it back to the shore to await its next fare, or perhaps to attend to another machine. You were now quite literally at sea in your own private cabin, the waves lapping around its base, the shore, a receding strip of bustling activity. The view from any tiny high-set window, if your machine boasted such a luxury and you dared to peek, would be of nothing but water and sky, enhancing the sense of isolation and perhaps the thrill of your impending dip. For a Victorian who perhaps lived their entire life in a smoky inland city, this controlled, wheeled entry into the vast, powerful ocean must have felt like a true adventure, albeit a very carefully managed one. The skill of the horse and its driver was crucial. They needed to navigate the slope of the beach, avoid any hidden rocks or particularly soft patches of sand where the wheels might get stuck, and position the machine correctly relative to the tide and the waves, ensuring the seaward steps were at a convenient and safe depth for the bather to enter the water. Too shallow and you'd be paddling in the puddles. Too deep and you might get an unwelcome surprise as you stepped out. It was a job that required a good understanding of local beach conditions and a patient, reliable animal. One imagines these seaside horses developed a certain stoic resignation to their daily routine of paddling back and forth, towing their human cargo in these peculiar wheeled contraptions. They probably had very strong opinions on the proper etiquette for signaling a return trip, mostly involving a well-aimed flick of a wet tail if the bather dallied too long. There's a quirky little tidbit that in some particularly busy or less affluent resorts where horses might have been a greater expense, teams of strong men or women, perhaps the bathing attendants themselves, would be responsible for pushing and pulling the machines into the water. You can picture them thigh-deep in the chilly waves, straining at the wheels or ropes, a testament to human ingenuity and the lengths to which Victorians would go to ensure a modest sea bath. It certainly adds a new layer to the concept of all-inclusive seaside service. Your personal changing room, complete with its own human-powered propulsion system. Historians still argue about the typical speed and smoothness of this horse-drawn journey seawards. Was it a gentle gliding experience or a rather more jarring, lurching affair that left the occupant feeling slightly seasick before they even touched the water? It likely depended greatly on the skill of the driver, the temperament of the horse, the condition of the beach, and the sturdiness of the machine itself. But for a few precious moments, you were the captain of your own tiny wheeled vessel, embarking on a very short but highly significant voyage from the mundane shore to the therapeutic embrace of the ocean. Your little wheeled cabin, your private bathing machine, has now completed its gentle horse-drawn journey into the sea, coming to a halt in what the attendant deems a suitable depth for your Victorian sensibilities and the prescribed therapeutic benefits of the ocean. The sounds of the beach have receded, replaced by the more immediate rush and murmur of the waves, lapping against the wooden sides of your temporary sanctuary. Inside, you've made your final adjustments to your voluminous bathing costume, perhaps taken a deep, steadying breath, and now the moment of truth, or rather the moment of water, has arrived. It's time for the grand plunge, or more accurately, the chaste and carefully managed descent into the often chilly embrace of the sea, a process frequently facilitated especially for ladies by those stalwart figures known as dippers. With the machine positioned correctly, its seaward end facing away from the prying eyes of the shore, you would open the door or draw back the curtain that led to the ocean. If your machine was equipped with one, the canvas modesty hood would be lowered, creating that private tunnel down to the water's surface, ensuring your emergence was as discreet as humanly possible. You'd then carefully make your way down the few wooden steps slippery with seawater, and perhaps a bit of seaweed, your heavy water-absorbing bathing costume already starting to feel like a lead weight. This is a mainstream historical fact. The exit from a Victorian bathing machine into the sea was typically made from steps at the seaward end, often under the concealment of a canvas hood that extended to the water, and female bathers in particular were commonly assisted by dippers, strong female attendants who would guide or even physically immerse them in the water. And it is here at the water's edge that you would often encounter the dipper, if you were a lady, a child, or perhaps a gentleman of a particularly nervous disposition. These dippers, as we've mentioned, were usually robust, experienced local women, their arms strong from years of hauling ropes and well-dipping people. They were the gatekeepers of the sea, the facilitators of the therapeutic plunge. Their role was not just to offer a steadying hand as you navigated the slippery steps and the unfamiliar pull of the undertow. Oh no. For many, particularly those who were frail, timid, or simply unaccustomed to the shock of cold seawater, the dipper's assistance was far more vigorous. Imagine the scene: you, a Victorian lady, tentatively place a toe into the bracingly cold water. You hesitate. The dipper, a figure of no-nonsense competence, might offer a word of encouragement, or she might simply take matters into her own capable hands. With a firm grip on your arm, or sometimes even by grasping you securely around the waist, she would guide, or in some cases bodily lift, and then purposefully dip you into the waves once, twice, perhaps even the medically prescribed 3 times for maximum therapeutic effect. It wasn't always a gentle immersion. It could be a swift, unceremonious dunking designed to get the ordeal over with quickly and ensure you received the full shocking benefit of the cold salt water. There was no room for delicate sensibilities when the dipper was on duty. Her job was to ensure you got thoroughly, if briefly, soaked. You came for the sea cure, and by Jove, she was going to make sure you got it whether you entirely liked the method or not. Some bathers found their brisk efficiency reassuring. Others, no doubt, found it utterly terrifying. Right then, Mrs. Miggins, in you go, one for the nerves, one for the vapors, and one for good luck. Splendid. For gentlemen, the process was generally more self-directed. They were expected to stride forth from their machines with manly fortitude, plunging into the waves with a robust disregard for the temperature. However, even they might benefit from the watchful eye of a male bathing attendant on shore, ready to offer assistance if someone got into difficulty, though direct physical dipping was not typically part of their service. Unless perhaps a gentleman was paying extra for the full, invigorating experience, which might involve being unexpectedly shoved off the steps by a burly attendant with a mischievous grin. One can only speculate. The actual bathing itself was often very brief. This wasn't usually about leisurely swimming or frolicking in the waves. For many, it was a quick, prescribed immersion, a health ritual rather than a recreational activity. You'd bob about for a few minutes, perhaps gasp a bit as the cold water seeped through your many layers of wool or flannel, try to maintain your footing against the pull of the current, and then all too soon it would be time to retreat. There's a quirky and slightly alarming tidbit that some particularly enthusiastic dippers were known for their surprise techniques. They might engage you in polite, distracting conversation about the weather or the quality of the local whelks, and then, when you were least expecting it, swoosh, under you'd go. It was all part of the bracing experience, designed to prevent any last-minute hesitation or unseemly shrieking that might disturb the genteel atmosphere of the bathing area. One imagines these dippers had a very dry sense of humor, and a collection of truly excellent stories they shared over a cup of tea at the end of a long day of surprising, unsuspecting gentlefolk. Historians still argue about the precise degree of force or persuasion used by these dippers and how much agency the bathers themselves had in the manner of their immersion. Were their dippers known for their gentle touch versus those renowned for their no-nonsense, get-it-done approach? And did bathers specifically request one or the other? Like choosing a particular masseuse at a modern spa, but with a higher chance of involuntary submersion. The records are often more focused on the machines than the minute-by-minute human interactions at the water's edge. But however it was accomplished, that chaste plunge, shielded from public view, often facilitated by a strong arm, was the culmination of a long and elaborate process. You had braved the journey, the cramped changing room, the trundle into the sea, and now you had faced the ocean itself, all while upholding the very highest standards of Victorian propriety. You've just experienced that bracing, if somewhat unceremonious, plunge into the chilly sea, aided or perhaps enthusiastically dunked by a robust dipper all under the discreet cover of your bathing machine's canvas hood. You are now officially sea bathing, a proper Victorian, enjoying the therapeutic if rather shivery embrace of the ocean. But your adventure in seaside etiquette is far from over. For even in the relative anonymity of the waves, Victorian society had strict rules about who could bathe, where, and with whom. Or more accurately, without whom. The concept of mixed bathing, men and women frolicking together in the sea, was for most of the 19th century deeply shocking and generally prohibited in respectable resorts. Thus you find yourself in carefully demarcated his and hers ocean zones, a testament to the era's unwavering commitment to segregated seaside propriety. As you bob about in your heavy woolen costume trying to look both invigorated and suitably modest, you would be acutely aware that the stretch of water you occupied was designated specifically for your gender. Beaches at popular Victorian resorts were typically divided into separate bathing areas for men and women. This is a mainstream historical fact. Strict segregation of the sexes for sea bathing was a common practice at British seaside resorts throughout much of the 19th century, with designated areas for male and female bathers often separated by a significant distance or a physical barrier like a groin or pier to prevent any improper viewing or mingling. Sometimes these zones were marked by flags or buoys, or simply understood by convention and enforced by beach attendants and public opinion. The ladies' bathing area would be a respectable distance from the gentlemen's, ensuring that no indelicate sights like a man's bare calf, heaven forbid, or a lady's ankle revealed by a rogue wave could possibly offend the sensibilities of the other sex. The bathing machines themselves would be lined up in their respective gender-specific zones. The horses that pulled the ladies' machines would be managed by male drivers, but the all-important dippers who assisted the ladies were invariably women. Similarly, male attendants serviced the gentlemen's machines. This careful choreography ensured that even the process of being wheeled into the sea and assisted with the plunge maintained the strict boundaries of gender separation. It was like having separate swimming pools, but with much more complicated changing rooms and a distinct lack of inflatable flamingos. Imagine the scene on one stretch of beach, a phalanx of bathing machines disgorging ladies in their voluminous dark costumes, perhaps attended by bonneted dippers. Further down the coast, perhaps a few hundred yards away, or even around a headland, if the resort was particularly concerned with propriety, would be the gentlemen's bathing area. Here, men in their striped, knee-length woolen suits might be engaging in slightly more boisterous, though still relatively decorous, aquatic activities. The invisible, or sometimes very visible line between these zones was not to be crossed. Any gentleman inadvertently straying too close to the ladies' area, or vice versa, would likely be met with stern rebukes, whistles from beach attendants, and a general atmosphere of scandalized horror. "Sir, remove your improperly located person from the vicinity of these delicate sea nymphs at once, or face the wrath of Mrs. Grundy and her entire entourage." The timing of bathing might also be segregated. Some resorts had specific hours designated for male and female bathing, especially on smaller beaches where physical separation was more difficult to maintain. Ladies might bathe in the morning, for instance, and gentlemen in the afternoon, or vice versa, ensuring that the beach and the nearshore waters were exclusively theirs during their allotted slot. This temporal segregation further minimized any chance of accidental and potentially shocking intermingling in a state of relative undress. However, relative that undress might be given their substantial costumes. There's a quirky little tidbit that even within these segregated zones, there could be further subtle divisions based on social class. While perhaps not officially demarcated, the more expensive bathing machines used by the wealthier clientele might be positioned on a slightly more desirable or private stretch of sand within the designated male or female area. Or certain dippers might be known to cater primarily to ladies of quality, offering a slightly more refined or perhaps just more expensive dunking experience. The subtle nuances of the British class system, it seems, extended even into the chilly waters of the English Channel. Your choice of bathing machine attendant could say as much about your social standing as your choice of milliner. Historians still argue about the actual effectiveness of this segregation in preventing all forms of intergender observation, especially with the rise of inexpensive telescopes and binoculars in the later Victorian period, which reputedly caused some moral panic. Could a determined gentleman with a powerful spyglass still catch a glimpse of the ladies emerging from their machines, despite the distance and the modesty hoods? And were there rogue waves of young men or women who deliberately tried to push the boundaries, much to the consternation of the beach patrols and self-appointed guardians of public morality? The system was designed for maximum propriety, but human nature and human curiosity being what they are, it was likely not entirely foolproof. But for you, the respectable Victorian bather, these segregated zones were a comforting reassurance. You could take your prescribed dip, enjoy the health-giving properties of the sea, and maintain your dignity, all within the carefully defined, gender-appropriate aquatic territory. It was another layer in the intricate and often slightly absurd performance of Victorian seaside leisure. You are now floating, or perhaps more accurately, bobbing with considerable effort in your heavy waterlogged bathing costume within your designated gender-segregated patch of the chilly Victorian Sea. You've successfully navigated the hiring of your wheeled cabin, the cramped change within its swaying confines, the horse-drawn journey into the waves, and the chaste, possibly dipper-assisted plunge. So, what was this all for? What was the actual experience of this much-vaunted Victorian sea bath like, and did it live up to its reputation as a panacea for all ills? Let's consider the bracing reality of that dip and the prevailing beliefs about its profound health benefits versus the often rather shocking and distinctly unbalmy experience. The primary justification for enduring all this elaborate seaside ritual for many Victorians was health. Remember Dr. Russell and his influential treatise on the virtues of seawater. By the mid-19th century, his ideas had become widely accepted, and sea bathing, along with the breathing of ozoniferous sea air, was prescribed by physicians for a staggering array of conditions. It was believed to cure everything from scrofula, a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes, often called the king's evil rickets, and various skin complaints to melancholy nerves, general weakness, and that wonderfully vague Victorian ailment, debility. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Victorian era saw a strong medical endorsement of thalassotherapy, the therapeutic use of seawater and the seaside environment with sea bathing, believed to stimulate circulation, improve glandular function, tone the system, and cure a wide variety of physical and nervous ailments. The cold shock of the water, followed by vigorous rubbing with a coarse towel, was thought to be particularly invigorating. So as you take your prescribed plunge, you are not just having a paddle, you are engaging in a serious medical treatment, a vital part of your quest for robust Victorian health. The very coldness of the water, which could be truly gasp-inducing, especially on the British coast, even in summer, was considered a key part of its efficacy. It was meant to be a shock to the system, a bracing, stimulating experience that would awaken the vital forces within. You weren't supposed to lounge about enjoying the gentle warmth. You were supposed to feel invigorated, almost assaulted by the elements. If your teeth weren't chattering and your skin wasn't turning a rather alarming shade of blue, you probably weren't doing it right, or at least not getting the full benefit. The dippers, those sturdy female attendants we've met, often played a crucial role in ensuring bathers received this full, shocking immersion. They weren't there to coddle you. They were there to ensure you got your money's worth of therapeutic cold. Their practice dunks were designed to be swift and efficient, preventing any cowardly last-minute retreats from the icy embrace of the waves. One can imagine them having a standard spiel. "That's it, madam. 3 good dips for the constitution." Knocks the humors right out of you, it does. You'll feel like a new woman, eventually, once you stop shivering. But what did it actually feel like? For many, particularly those unaccustomed to cold water or of a more delicate constitution, the experience was likely less invigorating and more utterly petrifying. The initial shock of the cold water hitting your skin, seeping through your many layers of wool or flannel, could literally take your breath away. The water was often murky, churned up by the waves and the passage of numerous bathing machines and horses. You might encounter unexpected seaweed tangling around your ankles, or the unpleasant sensation of a jellyfish brushing against your leg. The buoyancy of the salt water might be a novel experience, but your waterlogged costume would do its best to drag you down, making movement awkward and tiring. It was less a serene float and more a brief chilly and slightly panicked struggle against the elements and your own wardrobe. There's a quirky little tidbit that some Victorian doctors prescribed, not just the number of dips, but also the precise time of day for bathing, often very early in the morning, when the water was believed to be at its purest and most potent, and also coincidentally, its coldest. Imagine being roused from your warm boarding house bed before dawn, bundled into your bathing machine, and trundled out into the gray pre-sunrise chill for your prescribed icy plunge. It sounds less like a holiday treat and more like a particularly bleak form of penance. Perhaps the ensuing relief of finally getting back into warm, dry clothes was so profound that it was mistaken for a significant improvement in one's overall health. I survived another dawn dip, I must be cured. Historians still argue about the actual measurable health benefits of Victorian sea bathing practices versus the powerful placebo effect generated by the strong medical endorsement, the change of air and scene, the increased, if awkward, physical activity, and the general psychological boost of being on holiday and doing something good for oneself. While fresh air and exercise are undoubtedly beneficial, it's debatable whether repeated brief immersions in often very cold and sometimes polluted seawater, while clad in heavy bacteria-friendly wool, truly cured scrofula or banished melancholy, or if it just made you appreciate a warm fire and a hot cup of tea all the more afterwards. So, as you complete your allotted few minutes in the bracing Victorian sea, your teeth chattering a jaunty rhythm against the roar of the waves, you are participating in a ritual that was part medicine, part fashion, part social performance, and part sheer teeth-gritting endurance. Whether it truly bolstered your constitution or merely gave you a very impressive head cold, it was an essential and undeniably memorable part of the great Victorian seaside adventure. You've bravely endured your prescribed and likely very bracing dip in the Victorian Sea, emerging from the waves like a heavily swaddled, slightly blue-tinged but hopefully invigorated sea creature. Your brief, chilly communion with the ocean, facilitated by the ever-watchful dipper and the discreet hood of your bathing machine, is now complete. But the adventure in Victorian seaside modesty is not quite over. Now comes the equally important and equally private process of retreating from the deep, changing out of your sodden bathing costume, and re-emerging onto the beach as a respectable, dryly clad member of society. And once again, the humble bathing machine is your indispensable ally in this delicate operation. Having had your fill of the therapeutic, if somewhat shocking, sea water, you would signal your desire to return to shore. This might involve a wave to the bathing machine attendant or the horse driver watching from the beach, or perhaps if your machine was one of the more deluxe models, ringing a little bell or raising a small flag, a sort of room service, "I'd like my mobile changing cabin retrieved from the ocean now, please," signal. The horse patiently waiting on the sand, or perhaps already being re-hitched by the driver, would then be guided back into the shallows to reconnect with your personal aquatic chariot. With a gentle tug, or perhaps a more determined heave, if the tide had shifted or the wheels were a bit stuck in the wet sand, your bathing machine would begin its slow dripping journey back towards the beach. You inside would be experiencing the reverse of your outward trip, the sound of the waves receding, the distant hubbub of the promenade growing louder. You'd likely be shivering, your heavy woolen bathing costume clinging uncomfortably, and shedding impressive quantities of seawater onto the already damp wooden floor of the cabin. The primary goal now was to get out of this sodden, itchy garment and back into your warm, dry street clothes as quickly and as privately as possible. Once the machine was safely beached high enough on the sand to avoid any encroaching waves, but still within the designated bathing area, the landward door would remain firmly closed. This is a mainstream historical fact. After bathing, the Victorian bather would remain within the confines of the bathing machine as it was drawn back up the beach, allowing them to change back into their dry street clothes in complete privacy before re-emerging onto the public shore. The entire purpose of the machine was to avoid any public display of the body in a state of undress or in revealing wet bathing attire. So now begins the reverse of the earlier sartorial struggle, but with the added challenge of dealing with a very wet, very heavy, and probably very sandy bathing costume. Peeling off those sodden layers of flannel or serge, the gown, the bloomers, the stockings, in that cramped, humid space would require considerable effort. There would be no convenient hot shower, no fluffy towels fresh from a tumble dryer. You'd have a simple, probably slightly rough linen or cotton towel with which you'd attempt to dry yourself as best you could amidst the lingering dampness and the gritty sand that had inevitably found its way into every nook and cranny. It was less spa-like retreat and more slightly desperate wrestling match with a large wet sheep in a very small wobbly box. Once reasonably dry, or at least no longer actively dripping, you would then begin the painstaking process of redonning your many layers of Victorian street attire. The chemise, the drawers, the corset. Oh, the joy of relacing a corset onto slightly damp skin. The petticoats, the stockings, the dress or suit, the shoes, the hat, the gloves. Each item carefully retrieved from its peg and meticulously put back in place. All this while, ensuring that no glimpse of your person in any state of undress was visible through any potential crack or crevice in the bathing machine's structure. The Victorians were champions of layered dressing, which made for elegant silhouettes on land, but rather complicated logistics when it came to seaside changing rooms. There's a quirky little tidbit that some bathing machines might have had a small, strategically placed basin and perhaps a tiny ewer of fresh water, a rare luxury for a very quick rinse of the face and hands, to remove salt, or perhaps to dab at one's hair. More likely, any fresh water was reserved for a proper wash back at one's lodgings. Some accounts also mention the use of rubbers, not erasers, but rather attendants, often the dippers themselves who would vigorously rub down the bather with coarse towels after their dip, a practice believed to enhance circulation and the therapeutic effects of the sea bath. This rubbing, if it occurred, would also happen within the privacy of the machine, or perhaps in a slightly larger dedicated rubbing house on the shore, if the resort was particularly well equipped. It sounds less relaxing and more like being vigorously buffed like an old piece of silver. Historians still argue about the typical hygiene standards within the bathing machines themselves. With multiple users throughout the day, often emerging dripping wet and sandy, how clean could these little cabins truly have been? Were they regularly sluiced out? Did they smell perpetually of damp wool and faint mildew? Given the general sanitation standards of the era, one probably shouldn't imagine them as pristine, hygienically sealed pods. But for the Victorian bather, the privacy they afforded was paramount, outweighing almost any other consideration of comfort or cleanliness. Finally, fully redressed your hair, perhaps slightly askew, but your dignity firmly intact, you would signal that you were ready to emerge. The attendant would open the landward door, and you would step out back onto the solid, dry beach, a respectable Victorian once more, having braved the ocean and its rituals with utmost decorum. Your brief watery adventure, cocooned within your wheeled wooden shell, was complete. You have successfully navigated your modest retreat from the deep, emerging dry and fully re-attired from your personal bathing machine like a respectable Victorian butterfly from its wheeled wooden chrysalis. The bracing, if somewhat chilly encounter with the sea is behind you. But your immersion in the world of Victorian seaside propriety is not quite complete. Beyond the physical mechanics of using the bathing machine, there was a whole host of unwritten rules, social expectations, and sometimes even formally posted regulations that governed bathing behavior, all designed to ensure that the seaside experience remained orderly, decorous, and free from any hint of impropriety. This was the often unspoken, but deeply understood, bathing machine decorum. First and foremost, as we've touched upon, was the unwavering rule of gender segregation. Ladies bathed with ladies, gentlemen with gentlemen, and never the twain should meet, at least not in their bathing costumes or in the water. This was the bedrock of seaside decency. But even within your own gender-designated zone, there were expectations. You were expected to conduct yourself with a certain quiet dignity. Loud, boisterous behavior, excessive splashing, or any form of unseemly cavorting in the waves was generally frowned upon, especially in the ladies' bathing area. This is a mainstream historical fact. Victorian seaside resorts often had strict codes of conduct, both written and unwritten, governing bathers' behavior, emphasizing modesty, quiet decorum, and the avoidance of any actions that could be construed as vulgar, indecorous, or likely to cause offense to other beachgoers or promenaders. The bathing machine itself was to be treated with respect. You didn't loiter inside it for an unduly long time after your dip as others would be waiting their turn. You were expected to change relatively briskly, though allowances were made for the complexities of Victorian attire. Leaving the interior in a dreadful state, excessively sandy or with your wet bathing costume carelessly discarded on the floor, would have been considered very bad form. The attendants, after all, had to prepare it for the next bather. Think of it as the unspoken, leave your tiny wooden box as you would wish to find it. Rule if Victorians had such catchy informal slogans. Interaction with the bathing machine. Attendants, particularly the dippers for ladies, also had its own etiquette. While these attendants were there to assist, they were still working-class individuals, and a certain social distance, however blurred by the intimacy of the dipping process, was generally maintained by upper and middle-class bathers. You would be polite, of course, and likely tip them for their services, but overly familiar chatter or a disregard for their role was not appropriate. They were there to perform a function efficiently and discreetly. One imagines the dippers themselves had a very keen sense of which ladies were true gentry and which were merely putting on airs, based entirely on how they navigated this slightly awkward class-bridging interaction at the water's edge. Then there was the matter of timing. You didn't monopolize a machine during peak hours. Some resorts might even have time limits for each bather's use of a machine, especially on very busy days. The whole system relied on a reasonably efficient turnover to allow as many people as possible to partake in the health-giving waters. Punctuality, if you had booked a machine for a specific time, would also have been expected. Keeping a horse a driver and a dipper waiting was not the done thing, and probably incurred their silent, salty disapproval. There's a quirky and rather specific piece of etiquette that related to the very act of looking while at the seaside. While ladies were of course expected to be shielded from the male gaze during their actual immersion, even on the promenade or sitting on the beach in their full street attire, a certain custody of the eyes was expected. Ladies were not to stare overtly at gentlemen, and gentlemen were certainly not to ogle ladies even if they were just paddling at the very edge of the water, with their skirts hitched up a daring for the time inch or two. The use of telescopes or opera glasses on the beach, while sometimes employed for admiring distant ships or scenic views, could also be a source of suspicion if they seemed to be lingering too long on the bathing areas. Is Mr. Abernathy admiring the geological strata of those far cliffs? Or is he attempting to ascertain the exact number of ruffles on Mrs. Periwinkle's bathing cap from half a mile away? One does wonder. The bathing costume itself, as we've discussed, was subject to intense scrutiny. Wearing a costume that was too old, too faded, too tight, or, heaven forbid, too short, could lead to social ostracism or even intervention by beach officials. Some resorts published lists of approved bathing costume suppliers, or even detailed regulations about the length of skirts and sleeves. It was a serious sartorial minefield. Yes. Historians still argue about the degree of regional variation in these seaside etiquette rules and how strictly they were enforced across different types of resorts. From the ultra-fashionable and exclusive like Cowes during Regatta Week, to the more popular mass-market destinations like Blackpool or Southend. It's likely that the level of formality and the stringency of the rules differed, with more latitude perhaps allowed or simply harder to police in the larger, more boisterous working-class resorts. However, the underlying Victorian obsession with public propriety and the clear demarcation of social boundaries would have been a common thread everywhere. Even the act of drying off and re-emerging from the bathing machine had its unspoken rules. You didn't fling open the door while still half-dressed or with your hair dripping wet. You waited until you were fully and impeccably re-attired, ready to face the public gaze once more, as a model of Victorian decorum, perhaps with a healthy or fashionably pale glow from your brief encounter with the sea, but with no other hint of the rather damp and undignified struggle that had just occurred within that little wheeled hut. The gentle art of using a bathing machine was in essence the art of making something inherently awkward look effortlessly proper. You are now a seasoned veteran of Victorian seaside decorum, having successfully navigated the hiring of your bathing machine. The cramped change, the horse-drawn journey seawards, the bracing dip assisted, or otherwise the modest retreat, and the meticulous redressing process, all while adhering to the strict, if sometimes unspoken rules of beach etiquette. You've emerged onto the shore, a paragon of respectability, feeling perhaps healthier, if still a little damp behind the ears. But even with all these elaborate precautions, the segregated bathing zones, the voluminous costumes, the wheeled cabins of privacy, the Victorian mind ever alert to potential impropriety still harbored anxieties. The seaside, for all its wholesome reputation, could also be a place of lurking dangers to morality, not least from the dreaded peeping Tom and the ever-present threat of some minor or major seaside scandal. The very existence of the bathing machine with its canvas hood designed to shield the bather from view speaks volumes about the Victorian obsession with preventing any illicit glimpses of the human form in a state of relative undress. This is a mainstream historical fact. Despite the elaborate precautions taken to ensure modesty during sea bathing in the Victorian era, there remained a persistent societal anxiety about peeping toms, or improper observation, leading to rules about the distance between male and female bathing areas, the use of telescopes on beaches, and the careful positioning of bathing machines. The fear was that some unscrupulous individual armed with a spyglass or simply a keen and improperly directed eye might try to circumvent these carefully constructed barriers of propriety. Imagine the scene: ladies emerging from their machines under the canvas hood, believing themselves to be completely concealed. Yet, from a distant cliff path, or perhaps from a strategically anchored rowing boat captained by some vulgar fellow, or even from a nearby gentleman's bathing area, if the segregation was not perfectly maintained, a determined peeping Tom might still attempt to catch a forbidden glimpse. Newspapers and satirical journals of the time sometimes featured humorous or occasionally more alarmed accounts and cartoons depicting such scenarios. It was a recurring trope, playing on both the desire for seaside titillation and the moral panic it induced. You can almost hear the hushed whispers on the promenade. Did you hear about young Master Algernon caught with his father's best brass telescope pointed directly at the ladies' bathing machines? The scandal. His mother has taken to her bed with a fit of the vapors. To combat this perceived threat, seaside resorts often employed beach attendants or even local constables to patrol the shores, ensuring that gentlemen did not stray too close to the ladies' designated areas, and that no one was using optical aids for nefarious purposes. Some resorts had specific bylaws prohibiting the use of telescopes in certain zones, or dictating that bathing machines be positioned with their backs squarely to any public thoroughfares. The very architecture of the seaside was often designed with these anxieties in mind. Promenades built high above the beach or strategically placed breakwaters could help to obscure the view of the bathing areas. But it wasn't just deliberate peeping that caused concern. Accidental encounters or situations where modesty might be inadvertently compromised were also a source of anxiety. What if a lady's bathing machine got stuck in the sand too close to shore and she couldn't be pulled out to a suitably private depth? What if a sudden gust of wind lifted the canvas hood at an inopportune moment? What if a gentleman emerging from his own machine after a vigorous swim found himself unexpectedly face to face with a line of ladies' machines being trundled past? These were the nightmare scenarios that kept the arbiters of Victorian decency awake at night, when they weren't worrying about the proper hem length for bathing bloomers, of course. There's a quirky little tidbit that highlights this obsession with preventing any illicit viewing. Some early bathing machines were designed with no windows on the landward side at all, or only very small, very high ones, precisely to prevent anyone on shore from seeing in, and perhaps to prevent the bather from being too tempted to look out at the mixed scene on the beach while changing. It was like a tiny mobile fortress of virtue. Some even more elaborate machines were rumored to have a system of opaque screens or curtains that could be deployed inside the machine by the bather if they felt particularly vulnerable, adding an extra layer of fabric-based security against the imagined leering gaze. My dear, this new bathing machine has a triple-locked door reinforced canvas and an internal anti-ogle curtain system. One simply cannot be too careful when exposing one's ankles to the brine. Historians still argue about the actual prevalence of peeping Tom incidents versus the level of moral panic and anxiety surrounding the idea of them. Were Victorian beaches really teeming with lascivious spies armed with telescopes? Or was this more a reflection of the era's broader anxieties about female vulnerability class interactions and the potential for social disorder in these new, somewhat unregulated leisure spaces? The very act of women and men partially disrobing even in private and entering the wild domain of the sea was a departure from the tightly controlled environments of the Victorian home and drawing room, and this novelty itself likely bred a certain unease among moral commentators. These concerns also fueled the market for increasingly modest bathing costumes and more secure bathing machines. Entrepreneurs were quick to advertise features that promised enhanced privacy and protection from unwanted observation. The gentle art of using a bathing machine wasn't just about getting into the water. It was about participating in a complex system designed to navigate the thrilling but potentially perilous waters of Victorian social propriety, all while trying to avoid catching a chill or being the subject of the latest seaside scandal. You've now fully experienced the elaborate, often comical and deeply serious business of Victorian sea bathing, from the weighty woolen costumes and the horse-drawn wheeled cabins to the segregated ocean zones and the ever-present anxieties about peeping toms and compromised modesty. For several decades, the bathing machine reigned supreme as the indispensable, if somewhat cumbersome, facilitator of this peculiar seaside ritual. But like all fashions and technologies, however ingenious or socially necessary, they may seem at the time, the era of the bathing machine eventually began to wane. Its slow, creaking sunset was brought about by a confluence of changing social norms, evolving ideas about health and leisure, and a gradual, if reluctant, relaxation of those once ironclad rules of Victorian propriety. As the 19th century drew to a close and the Edwardian era dawned in the early 20th century, attitudes towards the body, public decency, and recreation began to shift, albeit slowly and unevenly. The strict, almost suffocating prudery of the high Victorian period started to give way to a slightly more relaxed and open atmosphere. This is a mainstream historical fact. The decline in the use of bathing machines began in the late 19th century and accelerated in the early 20th century due to several factors, including changing social attitudes towards modesty and the body, the increasing popularity of actual swimming as a sport, rather than just medicinal dipping, the development of more practical and less concealing swimwear, and the eventual acceptance of mixed-sex bathing at many resorts. One of the key factors was the changing nature of sea bathing itself. The Victorian emphasis on a quick, cold, therapeutic dip, often prescribed by doctors and facilitated by dippers, gradually evolved into a more recreational activity. People, especially younger generations, wanted to actually swim, to splash about, to enjoy the water for its own sake, not just as a chilly medical treatment. Those voluminous, waterlogged woolen costumes and the brief, constrained experience offered by the bathing machine were simply not conducive to energetic aquatic pursuits. You couldn't exactly execute a graceful crawl stroke while swaddled in several pounds of wet flannel, and fearing your modesty hood might detach and float off towards the gentlemen's section. Swimwear itself began to evolve. While still a far cry from the skimpy attire of today, bathing costumes for both men and women started to become slightly more streamlined, made from lighter fabrics and designed for a little more freedom of movement. As these less cumbersome, though still very modest by our standards, swimsuits gained acceptance. The need to change in complete privacy right at the water's edge inside a wheeled hut became less pressing. Beach huts, or permanent changing chalets, set back from the immediate shoreline, began to appear, offering a more convenient, if less mobile, alternative for disrobing. Perhaps the biggest nail in the coffin of the bathing machine was the gradual and often fiercely debated acceptance of mixed bathing. The idea of men and women being allowed to bathe and swim in the same designated areas of the sea, even if still clad in relatively modest attire, was revolutionary and for many traditionalists deeply shocking. But the tide of social change, as they say, was turning. Younger generations, influenced by new ideas about health, athleticism, and a more companionable relationship between the sexes, began to push for less segregation and more freedom at the seaside. If you could actually be seen on the beach in your bathing costume without causing a major scandal, then the primary purpose of the bathing machine, to transport you unseen into the water, became largely redundant. You might still want a private place to change, but a stationary beach hut served that purpose just as well and was far less trouble than a horse-drawn aquatic vehicle. The decline wasn't instantaneous, of course. Bathing machines lingered on at some more conservative resorts well into the early 20th century, particularly for older or more delicate bathers who still preferred the traditional private method of entering the water. You can almost picture a few die-hard Victorian matrons resolutely trundling into the waves in their wheeled cabins, tut-tutting at the scandalous sight of young men and women brazenly paddling in the same patch of ocean, their ankles practically visible to all and sundry. The world is going to the dogs, Matilda. Look at them, practically disrobed and cavorting like happy sea lions. There's a quirky little tidbit that some enterprising bathing machine proprietors, seeing their traditional business model threatened, tried to adapt. A few might have repurposed their machines as stationary beach huts for hire, simply removing the wheels or parking them permanently on the sand. Others might have offered them as quaint seaside tea rooms or photographic studios, capitalizing on their nostalgic charm even as their original function became obsolete. It was a valiant, if ultimately doomed, attempt to keep the wheeled cabins relevant in a rapidly changing world. Historians still argue about the precise timeline and the key tipping points in the decline of the bathing machine across different regions and social classes. Was it primarily a top-down change driven by a more liberal aristocracy and upper middle class, or a bottom-up pressure from a new generation of working-class and lower-middle-class holidaymakers who had less patience for the old formalities? It was likely a complex interaction of various social currents. But by the 1920s, the bathing machine, once an indispensable symbol of the Victorian seaside, had largely vanished from most British beaches, becoming a curious relic of a bygone era. A quaint reminder of a time when the simple act of taking a dip in the sea required a level of sartorial engineering and social choreography that seems almost unbelievable to us today. Its slow sunset marked the end of one chapter in seaside history and the dawn of a more relaxed, if perhaps less intriguingly peculiar approach to enjoying the ocean. You've now witnessed the rather charming, if somewhat cumbersome, reign of the Victorian bathing machine, from its ingenious conception as a guardian of seaside modesty to its eventual gentle roll into the sunset of history as social norms evolved and swimwear became slightly less like a deep-sea diving suit. Its decline marked a significant shift in how people interacted with the seaside, moving from a highly ritualized, health-focused, and modesty-obsessed activity towards the more relaxed, recreational beach culture we recognize today. As our sleepy journey through these Victorian seaside adventures draws to a close, let's take a final, reflective paddle in the waters of its legacy, considering what the peculiar charm of the bathing machine and the era it represented can still tell us. The most obvious legacy of the bathing machine is as a potent symbol of Victorian prudery and their often extreme efforts to manage public and private behavior. It stands as a quaint, almost comical testament to an age that could invent a wheeled wooden hut complete with a horse and driver, and sometimes a canvas modesty hood, all just to ensure that a lady didn't have to walk across a few yards of public beach in her already very concealing bathing costume. This is a mainstream historical fact. The bathing machine serves as a powerful historical emblem of Victorian-era social customs surrounding modesty, gender segregation, and the carefully controlled nature of public leisure, particularly concerning the exposure of the human body. It highlights a societal preoccupation with propriety that seems almost alien to many modern sensibilities. When you picture a bathing machine, you're not just seeing an object. You're seeing a whole set of cultural values made manifest in wood and wheels. You see the emphasis on reputation, the fear of scandal, the strict demarcation between public and private spheres, and the intricate rules that governed interactions between the sexes. It's a reminder that what we consider normal or natural behavior on a beach today, families swimming together, people sunbathing in relatively minimal attire, would have been utterly unthinkable and probably prosecutable for much of the 19th century. Our modern beach freedom was hard-won, or perhaps just gradually awkwardly evolved from under the canvas hood of machines like these. But beyond just being a symbol of quaint repression, the bathing machine also tells us something about Victorian ingenuity and their embrace of new technologies and experiences, albeit within their own strict framework. The rise of the seaside itself was linked to the railway, a marvel of modern engineering. And the bathing machine in its own way was a piece of specialized technology designed to solve a specific social problem: how to get people into the sea properly. It might seem absurd to us, but it was a practical solution for its time, allowing thousands to access the perceived health benefits of sea bathing who might otherwise have been barred by the constraints of modesty. It was, in its own way, an enabler of a new form of leisure. There's a rather charming, quirky thought that the bathing machine, by its very nature, created a unique, almost theatrical experience of entering the water. Imagine the anticipation building as you changed in that little cabin, the sound of the waves growing closer as you were trundled seawards, and then that final dramatic reveal as you stepped down into the ocean, your own private stage for a brief aquatic performance. It was certainly more of an event than just wandering down the beach and wading in. Perhaps there was a certain romantic or adventurous appeal to this carefully managed immersion, a sense of being in a little world of one's own, shielded from the everyday. It was your personal horse-drawn portal to the mighty brine. Historians still argue about the true lived experience of using a bathing machine for the average Victorian. Was it seen as a delightful convenience, a tiresome necessity, a slightly frightening ordeal, or a comical absurdity, even then. It was likely all of these things depending on the individual, the specific resort, the weather, and the efficiency, or otherwise, of the machine and its attendants. The surviving accounts, often from middle or upper-class diarists or satirists, give us glimpses, but the voices of the dippers, the horse drivers, or the working-class families who might have used the cheaper machines are harder to hear. What the bathing machine ultimately reminds us of is the ever-changing nature of social norms and how profoundly our relationship with our bodies, with nature, and with public space is shaped by the cultural currents of our time. The Victorian waves of modesty that necessitated such an invention have long since receded, leaving behind a shoreline of more relaxed attitudes. Yet in the faded photographs and quaint illustrations of these wheeled cabins, we can still catch an echo of that era's peculiar charm, its earnest anxieties, and its unwavering commitment to doing things, even something as simple as going for a swim, in what it considered to be the proper way. It's a gentle lesson in how even the most deeply entrenched customs can eventually become fascinating and rather sleepy historical curiosities. And so, as the last imaginary bathing machine is drawn up onto the beach of your mind, its wheels leaving faint tracks in the sands of time, our Victorian seaside adventure comes to its peaceful conclusion. The cries of the gulls, the distant oom-pa of the brass band, and the gentle lapping of waves against those sturdy wooden cabins now begin to soften and fade, carried away on the evening breeze. The sun has set on that era of elaborate aquatic etiquette, leaving behind a quiet sense of nostalgia for a world so different from our own, yet filled with the same human desires for health, for leisure, and perhaps for just a little bit of well-managed fun. Let the image of those determined Victorians braving the chilly waters in their voluminous attire bring a gentle smile to your face as you drift deeper into relaxation. There are no more rules of decorum to navigate, no more cramped changes in swaying huts. Only the calm, steady rhythm of your own breath, like the gentle turning of the tide. The charming, if slightly absurd world of the bathing machine now recedes into the quiet library of history. May your own journey into sleep be smooth, untroubled, and refreshingly simple.